The 20 or 30-year goal is to build an actual physical city of at least 1 million people. I think we're going to run a lot of experiments on governance, and there's also a lot of economic experimentation that can happen as well. I think if you want to do anything with urban design that is unconventional and types of spaces that people haven't experienced before, it's very, very helpful. If you can shut down Times Square, 7th Avenue, if you can change Paris in the way that it's been changed, you can do it in these extremely high density, high traffic environments. You can really do it anywhere. Certainly, I would applaud that more than the attitude of don't build anything anywhere, right? And that's kind of where we're in the US. It's very difficult to build anything, and we have, a few decades to find a way to live more sustainably and more equitably. And we're very far from that now.
Hey there, you're listening to Campfire, a podcast where we interview leaders that are building new cities and other new models of living for digital nomads, creators, and remote workers. My name is Jackson Steger, and I work with Cabin to develop new neighborhoods and grow a community of nature-loving creators and builders. Today's interview features Ryan Rzepecki, founder and CEO of Spectra Cities and former founder and CEO of Jump Bikes, a bike share startup that sold to Uber in 2018. Spectra Cities just launched last week. It's a virtual city that builds real cities. Architects, engineers, urban designers, and more can all collaborate in a virtual environment to design new cities using VR and other awesome technology. Our conversation today attempts to answer the question, how do you cooperatively design and improve new cities before you build them? Campfire is produced by Cabin, which is building a new kind of city for creators called a network city. Our community is developing a global co-living network of physical locations that we call neighborhoods. If you want to create cool things or live near nature with other thoughtful people nearby, you can learn more about us by visiting cabin.city. Ryan Rzepecki, welcome to Campfire.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Congrats on the launch of Spectra. We're going to talk about Spectra. We're going to talk about Jump Bikes and all kinds of fun stuff later in the show. But first, I just want to kind of lean on your broader urban planning background. How have cities been planned for historically? And based on all the experiences that you've had, how should cities be planned?
By and large, cities haven't been very, very much planned in history. And they're these sort of organic agglomerations of people and jobs, and they kind of grow iteratively over time. There have been a few big attempts at more top-down city planning. Occasionally a country will move like its capital city to a different part of the country to kind of activate it. So something like Brasilia, or, maybe you'll have a large company building a company town. You also have things like the New York City street grid being put into place, which isn't like a complete city plan in terms of like, we don't think of that as a startup city in the same way that we would think of Brasilia, but it enabled the type of growth that followed. So yeah, by and large, organic growth, and then maybe planning a street grid. And in the last 70 years or 80 years, or actually now it's closer to 100 years, in the United States and many other places, they've adopted Euclidean zoning, which is very descriptive in terms of like what you can build and where. It's not necessarily saying, it's not necessarily like programming every block, but it really restricts what can be built. And I'd say for the most part has a negative effect on how things are built. What we're trying to do is allow for that sort of organic evolution of a city or of a concept for a city to happen, but to do that digitally. And so to find a large community of people that want to play around with urban design, with what the city of for the future would look like. How would we organize transportation? How would we do food production? How do we manage waste? How do we do all of those things? And kind of, use virtual reality, use virtual spaces to test these ideas, get excited by certain different directions, then find a piece of land and go out and build that in phases. And so the idea is can you get that sort of organic evolution that you have in real cities, have some of that take place digitally and have a community form around that digitally, then find the land. And then when you actually go to build, you're able to build a lot faster. And some of the ideas have been tested along the way.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great segue. I would love for you to just share what is Spectra and who's it for?
Yeah, so our initial launch is focused for folks that may be urban planners, architects, civil engineers, interior designers, landscape architects, folks that are placemakers, and then people that are world builders, like virtual world builders. So people that have experience with the Unity game engine, people that do 3D asset modeling, people that are into creating games. And so we want to sit at the intersection of those two groups and two communities, the physical placemakers and the virtual world builders, and give them a shared set of tools, give them an open source library of assets, and see what type of experimentation happens. We've released our V1 concept city and all of the assets that make it up as under a Creative Commons license, so you can actually download it, do with it what you like, and then hopefully some amount of that gets fed back into the project, and we continue to build out the virtual world.
Yeah, can you elaborate on that piece a little bit? It was kind of unclear to me. I'm not super familiar with open source models as a concept. Is there a strong revenue model in place for Spectra? Does there need to be, is the goal to make money, or is that secondary?
So the 20 or 30-year goal is to build an actual physical city of at least 1 million people. So it's a real large city that would grow out of this community. And along the way to that, there's lots of different ways to monetize and to create value. Certainly just on taking raw land and turning it into a thriving city, there's a lot of value that's created there. I see there's sort of being projects along the way that each have their kind of own ownership structure and management. For example, we have a farm here in Puerto Rico, an 80-acre farm that I want to kind of develop as part of Spectra and test some ideas around the types of buildings we want to put on there. Maybe we have a cooperatively run agricultural component. So test some of the governance ideas, test some of the physical place making ideas on a very small scale. I think there could be much bigger projects, neighborhood scale projects, more tourism focused projects. There could be a variety of projects that would want to tap into this community to test ideas. And if we've grown to a certain scale, it could be kind of a distribution outlet as well to find people that are interested in their projects. So is Spectra itself kind of the network, something that makes money directly? I think maybe in time. I think there's also probably a crypto angle on that as well. But I think the first thing is to actually build a community that's actually interested in placemaking and interested in building cities. And then we can kind of, layer on those economic incentives later and figure out the right governance model. We've sort of outlined in the white paper a multi-layered governance structure where, each block has its own governance. It's a cooperative or something like a kibbutz, which is kind of a communal living idea. And then that kind of ladders up and stacks up to a city level government. So I think we're going to run a lot of experiments on governance, and there's also a lot of economic experimentation that can happen as well. So yeah, I think there'll be a time and place for Spectra to accrue value itself at the network level, but well before that, I think there's specific projects that will have a more directly investable and a more directly monetizable path.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that that context. I'm curious. So at Cabin, we also attract many of these builder types, these urban designers, civil engineers, architects. Do you have any mechanisms in place for attracting placemakers at scale? How do you think about the community management side of finding those right kinds of people, besides maybe coming on podcasts like these?
Yeah, I think podcasts like this are pretty important, actually. I think the first wave is just tapping into my network and the network of the architecture studio that we're working with. It's called Numena, and getting it out through our own networks. I was encouraged that after the first week of launch, we had a few projects reach out to us. Basically, saw the announcement. They were doing something similar in the space. They were able to read through a website, understand the rough principles and how it might fit, and then reach out saying, I'm not exactly sure what you're doing, but I think it might be this, and I think it might be related to what we're doing. Maybe we can talk. And so for me, that's a week into it. It's a good signal that put out a message that people can understand and the right people will connect with. It wasn't meant to be a massive consumer launch, so much as just getting it out and trying to find the right people. More tactically, I think there's an interesting model of working with universities. So looking at architecture schools, urban planning schools, a lot of schools also have game design and development. And whether that's part of an official class or a club, or just a project. I think there's something interesting about partnering with universities to get people to use this playground. In fact, we actually have a partnership with a German university that's actually set up like a lab and some like VR treadmills and all kinds of equipment. And it's a transportation focused department that wants to like test ideas in a virtual world. So I see that as one of the primary paths that we're going to look to build community.
That's so cool. So I'm curious now. I'm starting to think of this more from helping the audience understand the onboarding into Spectra. Like for example, I know you're familiar with Phil Levin, who's been on the show before and introduced us. He has a property in Oakland called Radish, which is this collection of great buildings that we've talked about in the show as well. I kind of have this vision of building like the Radish of Venice, or where I currently live in LA, or like maybe something like that on like raw land in Hawaii or somewhere else. So say I wanted to do that, and say I wanted to do it with some other cabin folks who are interested in building a neighborhood with me. What could I do in Spectra right now or in the near future to start modeling that out?
I think that exists as the concept of a block. So, it'd be basically launching a block into Spectra. And, you could take the template buildings that we've put together, and, the people in your community can occupy virtual apartments in those buildings, and you can sort of use that as a starting point. One level deeper, if you have people on your team that have some of these design skills, either architecture skills or even just 3D modeling skills, you can design your own space and kind of plug into that and see if you can kind of submit those assets to Spectra to incorporate into the larger world. We'll have some amount of support for people to. What I've discovered through this process is that the tools that architects work in to make these assets and the tools that 3D modelers and game developers use and make things in, they're different, and they don't, and if you know one of those, it doesn't necessarily mean you understand the other and how the two play together. So I see a little bit of a role of us being able to bridge that gap. And if you sit on one side of the fence or the other, if you're an architect and you're familiar with those tools, or if you're a game developer, 3D asset modeler, and you use those tools, we can kind of bridge that gap and help get buildable assets into the virtual world.
So this idea of doing everything in the virtual world, what advantages do VR and AR offer, like user testing a city?
I think if you want to do anything with urban design that is unconventional and types of spaces that people haven't experienced before, it's very, very helpful. And so we're building it without any cars in the traditional sense in our city. So our ground floors have bikes and kind of golf cart size and smaller vehicles. And so for people to be in an environment like that and see what that might be like, I think is compelling. And I think being immersed in that world, you can understand it in a deeper way than if you just saw a nice rendering or a nice photograph or a nice video. So I think it's very important for that, particularly where you're trying to push the boundaries of into new types of forms that people don't experience every day. VR adoption is still relatively low. So we do want to be relatively cross-platform. We did today our first walkthroughs in Spatial, which is one of the virtual world platforms. So we ported all our assets, or some of our assets, over to Spatial. And Spatial supports mobile, supports browser. You can kind of navigate the virtual world through the browser, and it supports Quest VR. And so, if you're just interested in what we're doing, you can kind of actually go and see it in a few clicks, even if you don't have a VR headset. But I would say, in terms of really being immersed in a space and understanding the potential of a design, VR adds another element. And because VR adoption is relatively low, we do have some of these other modes of access. But we're also thinking about showing up to events with a VR headset and just like grabbing someone at a bar or restaurant and saying, hey, just put this on and come to this place for a while. And I've done that anecdotally over the last couple of months, and it's really fun. It actually reminds me a bit of my jump days, where we were, for many people, the first electric bike that they rode, and just the wow factor on their face. Like, they'd heard of a bicycle. I mean, they rode a bicycle, right? But they didn't realize like how game changing an e-bike is. And then they had that aha moment, and they had it with our product. I think there's an opportunity to do that a little bit with VR, where you may have never used it or used it like 3 years ago. And then we put a top of the line headset on you connected to a gaming PC, and you're seeing a really, really vivid virtual world simulating the future. I think there's a bit of an awakening and an aha you get that way. So we plan to do some like pop-ups and events.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to kind of go a little bit deeper into that 10 out of 10 VR cross with Spectra experience. Say at Neighborhood Zero, which is Kevin's first property outside of Austin, Texas. Like, let's say we took a shed and we kind of we outfitted it to be this Spectra studio where there's great Wi-Fi and a Spectra headset, and like, what are the other elements we might want to include in that space? Or similarly, maybe a professor listening to this, thinking about their lab or their classroom, what's the best possible experience we can co-create to have a good Spectra building time?
I mean, I think just having a gaming PC attached to something like the HP Reverb or any decent top of the line VR headset is pretty great. And it's not a huge elaborate setup, and it's really easy to do. But most people, even if they have a VR headset like the Quest 2, they don't have a gaming PC. That's what I found has been the barrier for a lot of people. So just having a room with those two things gets you like a good way there. It doesn't take up a lot of space, and it's not very expensive. What that lab in Germany did is they bought like a track pad that you kind of like walk on, and you like just walk on it, and it moves you through VR, which is really cool. And they're looking for other additional hardware devices to do that. Now, I've never used that stuff. I'm kind of excited to try that, and that's like another level of immersion. But I think like a big piece of it is just being visually immersed and looking around and seeing the world. And you get that with you can get a gaming laptop that'll run it for less than $2,000, and you can get a good headset for $600 or less. So it's not a crazy expense.
Awesome. That's really fun. I do now want to, you brought up Jump, and I want to kind of visit those days and all of the fun economics of micro mobility. So I live in Venice Beach in Los Angeles right now, where we're right next to Santa Monica. Santa Monica just pulled Lyft bikes out of the area, which I was really bummed about. I don't have a car. I have been here about a year trying to survive on just my bike and then the public micro mobility options that are available to me. But for whatever reason, Lyft pulled their bike, and I've just seen a lot of attempts in the micro mobility space fail or not succeed so much as maybe projects hope to. You successfully sold Jump to Uber. Just sort of a broad question here, but what makes micro mobility work and what makes it not work?
Yeah, it's fun to put the hat back on. I do think about it from time to time, since it was 12 years of my life. I think first thing is density of the city, and a place that's mixed use and great to walk in and great to bike in general, and has the density and the types of trips that you'd want to take. And so I had thought for quite a while that the European cities are much better suited for micromobility and had a clearer path to the usage, to being profitable. And what had happened during the boom years is a lot of places that just weren't very bike friendly places, or not really people friendly places. They're very car centric places, started getting lots and lots of bikes and scooters on the street. I think we had a few surprises. Like we launched in Sacramento, and based on some of the other cities we've been in, like Atlanta, Tampa, we didn't have huge expectations, but ended up doing quite well. So then we thought, well, maybe more places are like Sacramento, and places that we didn't think were going to work. Once they electrified, they're going to work pretty well. But I'd say by and large that was a red herring. That most of the places that didn't work very well in Gen 1 bike share, the earlier versions of bike share, also didn't work with scooters and e-bikes. And so honestly, that's a big part of what motivated me to do Spectra. Is I spent a good chunk of my career trying to make existing cities better. So before I started Jump, I'd worked for the New York City Department of Transportation for a little over a year, doing bike lanes, bike infrastructure. I got to work on the closure of Times Square to cars and opening up the pedestrian plaza. I got to do those type of projects. And I realized just how hard it is to change existing places. It's just these huge political battles, and we fought so hard to put in a few bike lanes, or we fought so hard to put in just a few hundred bikes into some of these cities. And I really started thinking, well, because the success of this mode is so dependent on the built environment, what would it be like if you could start from scratch and you could build a place for people and bicyclists from the very beginning. And that was sort of the inspiration. I don't want to say it won't work in many U.S. cities, but it's really hard. And I think where it does work is personally owned. I think we'll continue to grow and have some success. But to make this shared model work, you really need some density, and you turn over the assets. And that's just my observation in general, is that we tend to separate land use management from transportation management, and we get really bad outcomes as a result. So we just get limitless sprawl. And then because we have limitless sprawl, we can't really economically put in a bus line or train because it's so low density. And so I think you really need to look at those two things together. And transportation is a response to the land use. It's hard to take bad land use and then make good transportation.
I live near a street in Venice called Lincoln Boulevard. It's this 2 to 3 lane car congested, ugly road that is loud and not friendly at all to pedestrians. And I was on a Chat GPT bender, so I was just like, Chat GPT, how do I change car lanes in Venice Beach to bike lanes? And it gave this sort of general civic engagement answer, and then also followed up with a list of a few organizations to work with. And so then I reached out to this bike coalition. But I'm curious, generally, what is the process for a local citizen to want to become more engaged, to effectively change car lanes into protected bike lanes? What would you recommend?
I think that's actually one of the positive things over the last 20 years or so, that building streets with bikes in mind and with pedestrians in mind for probably at least 50 years or so, it was not best practice. The best practice was get as many lanes as possible, move as many cars as possible, as fast as possible. That's all the traffic engineers cared about. And so that's really just been shifting increasingly decade after decade, until now there's been enough experiments and enough different types of infrastructure that have been tested that really there's no excuse for a traffic engineer to say they can't do it. If you can shut down Times Square, 7th Avenue and Broadway and Times Square, if you can change Paris in the way that it's been changed, if you can do it in these extremely high density, high traffic environments, you can really do it anywhere. And so then what's lacking? So we have the toolkit now. We have particularly for bike infrastructure, it's often not very expensive. We're talking about paint and barriers. Then it's the political will. And so that's where what you're saying really does matter. If you care about your city, if you care about your built environment, how do you get involved in advocating? And so, I mean, a simple thing to do, and I wish there were better mechanisms of outreach, but usually cities will do some sort of public hearings for various bike and pedestrian projects. Often what happens, like most public hearings, a bunch of cranky people show up to complain about losing their parking. And it really does help when you get 3, 4, 5, 10 people to come to the podium and say, well, no, I want this. I live in this neighborhood. I want my kids to be able to do this. I would use it. And it just gives the other voice to it, that helps the project get approved. What ends up happening is, the city council people that are at that hearing, they may not have a lot of context. They probably don't have a lot of context. The staff people at the agency, the SFMTA or whatever agency is doing the project, they have a lot of context and they're really, really prepared. But sometimes it's elected officials and they don't, and they're just trying to read the room. And it's a terrible sample of people that are willing to come out at from 5 p.m. to midnight on a Tuesday night or whatever. That's not a really good way to collect feedback, but that's still what a lot of cities use. And so if you can make it to a hearing, it helps. There's a lot of open streets events that cities are holding now too. And so that's been sort of a vehicle for change where you're kind of temporarily closing down a street and getting people to come out to it. And so that's just kind of social and fun, and you might meet other people that are interested and passionate about it. Um, and then I think there's probably a level of advocacy that goes beyond that, which is if you're familiar with a particular treatment or a particular set of blocks, you can be really the one pushing for an improvement there. And cities will be responsive to some degree. And so if you know there's a particularly dangerous intersection, or you have a really interesting insight for a way to improve connectivity in a city, you could submit that, and then you can be kind of the advocate or the thorn in the side of the city to make it happen. So I think there's a spectrum between supporting existing city projects, enjoying infrastructure and kind of open streets when it happens, and then identifying a project and really being more of the advocate for it. Also, most cities, you don't have to do this in isolation. If you really care, most cities have some sort of active bike community, and some have nonprofits that you can either donate time or money to. And so you can connect to other people that care about this. And we're thankfully at a time where there's a critical mass in almost every major city of people working on this stuff.
Yeah, shout out to the Los Angeles County Bike Coalition, who responded to my tweet almost right away and sent a really thoughtful email. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. So cool. I know we're almost at time, so I want to make sure to get some more. You've given all this really tactical, helpful advice. I want to get a little more philosophical again, which is also kind of how we opened. There's this kind of debate in urban planning. I've seen a little bit about, should you build new cities versus should you try to change the ones that already exist? And your career is very interesting because you've spent meaningful time, I think, kind of doing both. And so I'm just curious what you think about that question. Is it one or the other, or I'll just let you take the floor.
And my background is also a mix of urban planning and technology, right? So I think the technologists gets excited about new systems and thinking outside of existing frameworks to come up with something better. And then urban planners, as a group, I would say, tend to be more conservative and care about how do we make small changes to the existing system. I think both are important. I certainly learned a lot through my time doing that work. I certainly applaud anybody trying to make even small changes in their city, like we just talked about. That if you're doing the good work of improving the bikeability and pedestrian experience, that's awesome, and we should continue to do that. I think where I would to the urban planners in particular that say, well, all these new cities, we should just fix existing cities, and we shouldn't engage in this greenfield development. There's several responses. First, the global population is growing, and we're urbanizing at the same time. So I think Africa alone is going to add 1 billion urban residents. I think globally it's maybe 2, maybe more. And so those people have to live somewhere. And the existing cities as we have them aren't going to be able to accommodate that growth. So we need new places, and we can either plan with that in mind and try to build better places that reflect the future we want to live in, rather than repeating the mistakes of the past. And so just on a pure demographic look into the future, we know we need new places. I think we also need zones where you can experiment, where you can try different things and have them hopefully be successful. And some will work for other new cities. Some will be able to be fed back into existing cities. I mean, there's probably some of the things that we're doing that would be hard to implement into an existing city. But I think there's gonna be learnings there that flow backward. And so it's worth undertaking for that as well. And then I think we just need lots of shots on goal, to be honest. Like I think the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia got a lot of criticism. It's certainly we've made very different design choices for the city we're working on, but it's different, right? Like they're doing something, they're putting something out there. Certainly I would applaud that more than the attitude of don't build anything anywhere, right? And that's kind of where we're in the US. It's very difficult to build anything. everybody comes up and tries to block and obstruct everything. And so I think trying to build new things, and particularly if they're dense and they're car free, which Neom is, I think it's worth doing. And so I think, yeah, we need these experiments, and we need lots of them, and we have, a few decades to find a way to live more sustainably, and more equitably, and we're very far from that now. And so let's run many of these experiments. Let's incrementally fix the cities we have, and let's take some moonshots on what could a new greenfield city be, and let's do both.
Well, cheers to more shots on goal. Love what you all are making happen at Spectra to enable those shots, and we're trying to do the same at Cabin. And thanks so much for coming on the show, Ryan. Where can people learn more if they'd like?
Yeah, so we just launched the website, spectracities.com. We have spatial scenes, virtual scenes that you can go through, and those are linked on the site and on our Discord. And so you can actually kind of browse all those scenes. And we're hosting weekly walkthroughs, so you can actually give you little tours of the scenes in spatial and in PCVR if you have PCVR. So go to spectracities.com, join a Discord, do a tour, and go see the scenes on spatial. Then you'll have a good feel for what we're doing. And if you feel you have the skill set to contribute, or you just have the interest to contribute, reach out, and we're building a community that's going to continue to add to the world and evolve it.
Great. And just I'll add a personal testament, even on just a desktop browser, looks like a very fluid and user-friendly experience. So I'd encourage everyone to go check it out. Thanks again, Ryan, and hope to keep following your journey and seeing the great ways that you're changing cities and building new ones.
Thanks, Jackson. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.